Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jana Hazová, and I'm Vice President of CEER and co-chair of CEER Customer and Retail Markets Working Group and of the ACER Retail Working Group. On behalf of ACER and CEER, it's a pleasure to have you all here for today's webinar, where we launch the ACER-CEER 2024 Market Monitoring Report on Energy Retail and Consumer Protection. The theme of this year's report is Active Consumer Participation is Key to Driving the Energy Transition. How can it happen? Before we start today's webinar, let me please share with you a few housekeeping rules. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. We would also like to inform you that both slides and recording will be uploaded to the ACER website. You can ask your questions by using the Slido tool, or you also can access Slido through a link which will be shown in a while in the chat. Your questions will be addressed during the relevant Q&A session, although they can be posed at any time. Also, questions from other participants can be liked to increase their visibility. This 2024 Market Monitoring Report on Energy Retail and Consumer Protection, published just last week, provides a detailed analysis of Europe's retail energy markets. It offers key insights into the challenges and opportunities as we transition our energy systems. Let me begin by sharing some introductory remarks on this annual monitoring analysis undertaken jointly by ACER and CEER. In order to navigate the path ahead effectively, it is essential to fully understand the current dynamics of energy retail markets today, but also examine what is needed for tomorrow in terms of both decarbonization and consumer protection. The Market Monitoring Report plays a significant role in this regard, providing the data and insights necessary for informed decision-making. The importance of understanding the markets becomes even clearer when we consider the recent energy crisis. We witnessed unprecedented spikes in wholesale energy prices, which heavily impacted consumer bills. We were and we remain focused on the EU's long-term goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. In this context, it's obvious that rapid and bold changes are needed. This year's report, Active Consumer Participation is Key to Driving the Energy Transition. How can it happen? Emphasizes that the clean energy transition will not succeed without two critical components: power system flexibility and active participation of energy consumers. The report demonstrates that retail markets can play a pivotal role as providers of flexibility. Unlocking more flexible retail consumption is not just crucial for the success of the energy transition. It also provides opportunities for consumers to benefit from lower energy prices and to have greater control over their energy usage. In a moment, Seamus Byrne from ACER will delve deeper into the report's conclusions and recommendations. Following to Seamus's presentation, we will have a Q&A panel discussion focused on the potential of new contracts and how effective communication can shape consumer decisions. The panel will be moderated by my colleague, Natalie McCoy, and I'm also delighted to introduce our panelists. Philip Levis from VASA ITT, Jacobo Fernandez from the Spanish Regulatory Authority, CNMC, and Pete Lun from the Economic and Social Research Institute. The webinar will conclude with closing remarks from Cilla Bartok of ACER. Let's dive into the ACER-CEER 2024 Market Monitoring Report on Energy Retail and Consumer Protection. Today's insights will show how active consumer participation can drive the energy transition, benefiting both the markets and consumers. I hope the information shared sparks dialogue and action as we work to get towards a cleaner, more flexible energy future. Seamus, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jana. Okay, so just a brief introduction. My name is Seamus Byrne. I'm a policy officer here within ACER, and I work in the hydrogen, gas and retail department. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of our recommendations and conclusions from this year's market monitoring report. So just as a brief introduction, as Jana referenced, we made a bit of a pivot this year where we focused on, well, the level of flexibility and the need for flexibility that we see within their markets, and to kind of examine where we are with them. So just to kind of give you high-level conclusions, what we see. So when we talk about smart meters, we see them as a key piece of infrastructure needed to enable flexibility at the retail level. But while we do have broad rollout of smart meters in different member states, we do see that there's quite a number that have a very small rollout. So we still have 10 member states that have less than 30% of smart meter rollout in their markets. But then of these, 6 have a rollout of less than 10%. One thing that's kind of popped up at wholesale level this year is we've seen a significant increase, and this is a 12-fold increase of negative and low energy prices. While this isn't the fault of the retail sector, it does signify how we do need more flexibility at retail level because there are benefits potentially there. Across the EU, we're seeing that 73% of households are on kind of fixed or fixed term contracts. And these are really, in our view, inhibiting more flexibility at the consumer side. So we're interested in looking at this going forward. And then kind of linked with this, we still continue to see untargeted price interventions. So we have 8 member states with price interventions in their markets. And mainly this is regulated prices at fixed costs. But more broadly, we still see some follow-on from the energy crisis with broad untargeted supports being provided to energy consumers. A little mini dive on a few points that we would like to highlight. So flexibility is becoming the name of the game here. So if you cast your eyes to the very left, we can see that dispatchable generation is falling. So this is our gray. As you move from 2010 to 2030, you see that these figures are getting smaller. So what this means is we need a more flexible consumer base. Casting your eyes to the right-hand side, where we see that there's going to be a significant surge in the need for flexibility by 2030, and explicitly daily flexibility needs. What we see today is if you have a large cohort of consumers on fixed price contracts, that may be difficult to deliver. So this is what we're trying to get in the report this year. It's not just a traditional look back, we start casting our minds a bit forward to see what the issues are coming down the tracks if we have inaction on our part. So touching again on the negative and low energy prices, as I said at the outline, we've seen a massive increase of these in 2024. There are difficulties with this and there are potential benefits. Looking at the level of contract uptake that we have with our consumers, we can see that it's difficult for them to kind of access the potential benefit of this. But then also, if this were to continue, you might have difficulty from a supply side or a generational side of you're going to have to start building this into your models. So this could lead to further costs down the track for our end consumers. So our whole aim here is if we can get a more flexible consumer base, we can actually deliver benefits to all. It's not that every consumer has to be flexible, just a cohort. So looking at the smart meters. So in each report for the last number of years, we've been touching on the need for smart meters. So at a foundational level, they allow consumers to actually see real-time data. So when you look to the very left here, we see that in general, we have quite a broad uptake and rollout of smart meters across the EU. However, when you start moving to the right, and so we have the two maps on the right, so the left-hand side is the households and the right-hand side is the non-households. We can see that, yes, they might have smart meters, but the engagement with flexible contracts is limited. So it's more that we need to start pushing the consumer, like see what type of nudges are available to get them to engage a little bit more. Traditionally, they might prefer a fixed price contract, but in a lot of cases, these offers aren't even made available to them. So this is one of the points we're wanting to highlight. So we have infrastructure in many places, but it just appears to not be utilized. Again, touching on the dominance of the fixed price contracts and how it limits flexibility. So again, and this is probably one of our weak points in our report that we touch on. So on the very left-hand side here, you have, these are household contract uptakes. So in general, we have the fixed price contract is more prevalent. You will see a number of countries here which are other. What this means in these cases is we have variable price contracts, but they're fixed for a set period of time, and then the supplier will change and they will give 30 days notice. In Element, it is very much a fixed price contract with a limited variability built into it. It's not time of use. Then you can see kind of a slightly better story on the non-household consumer. However, we have very limited data on this. And then looking at the kind of the potential for flexibility, it's not going to be any particular type of consumer. You might have short-term wins with maybe the non-household or the industrial consumer, but the residential consumer will have a part to play in this going forward. You will see more EV utilizations, heat pumps. These all create potential flexibility, which we should look at in the future. That is largely it. Some high-level recommendations from my side. So what we were looking at is, well, what do we need to see change here? We need more demand-side response, so our regulatory framework should evolve to permit this and enable it. And this is in advance of 2030, so casting your minds back to this need for flexibility that we see. We have the new EMD with the need for more consumer protection. However, we think that this must be balanced and we should see a stop to the untargeted provision of supports to consumers. And then also looking at, well, the distribution system operators and how they are a key point of contact with their consumers. They may face difficulties in actually building more grid going forward. So there's access or potential incentivization mechanisms that regulators should look at here to ensure a more efficient grid use and upfront investment. Access to flexibility. We kind of have a key theme here with the need for flexibility going forward. So it's not just any particular body, it's actually all. So it's regulators, it's distribution system operators, and member states. So if the smart meters aren't provided for, they should look at moving this on much, much quicker. But then also linked with this, we're looking for a provision of a broad range of flexible contract offers. And in particular here, what we're pushing for is dynamic price contracts, because what we see is once you have a dynamic price contract offer available in the market, you see other offers coming through, and Philip will touch on these in his slides in the next in the panel discussion. And finally, like informed and incentivized consumers. So what we see is in a lot of cases you have the provision of the offers, such as dynamic, but we see a limited uptake of them. Jacobo will touch on this as well. So we think there's a lacking of information. We saw some good points that came out of the energy crisis on this, where the information provision came a lot stronger, more dynamic. We're wanting this to become more broadly aware, or the consumer to be more broadly aware of the benefits of these dynamic price contracts. But also it's important that we show like there are potential downsides if you're inactive. So there's a potential benefit in that you will save money if you adjust your behavior, but if you don't, you may have higher costs during certain periods of the day. That it is all from me. So what I will do is I'll move to the panel discussion. Natalie, if you want to take control, or possibly Philip takes control here.
Thank you very much, Seamus. I think the findings are and the perspective of this year's report are very, very interesting, and I'm sure it's given our participants and interested stakeholders, if you will, a different way of looking at retail markets across the EU. And we hope very much that this new approach is welcomed and appreciated. And I think it helps to put in perspective the reality and also in line with, the goals and objectives that Europe and a brighter community have set ourselves to deliver an energy transition and to find energy savings and efficiency as best we can. So our next part of today's program, as we heard from Jana earlier, is a panel discussion and from our three speakers. So as not to waste any more time, I'll hand over directly to Philip Lewis from Vaza ETT. For those of you who do not know Vaza ETT, they are an energy consultancy. I like to think of them more as a think tank, but officially they are also a consultancy providing some pretty in-depth analytics about energy markets around the world, in fact. And as we'll see during Philip's presentation now, this gives them really enriches their research and their analysis, because we can see experiences all over the world and different ways of facing some of the same problems that we're discussing here, and the same ambitions as well. So over to you, Philip. Very eager to learn what's happening out there.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here and fully agree with all the suggestions and conclusions on the report. And just wanted to then raise a few points on the challenges, of course, because we all, of course, realize that the challenges that are involved with achieving this uptake of these dynamic tariffs. And just wanted to go through a few of those and think about a couple of the potential solutions to that and way forwards for that. And first of all, of course, we realize that there is a perceived risk by consumers. Consumers are, of course, very cautious to move into dynamic tariffs, especially in an environment where they don't really necessarily get a lot of communication on those. And one of the possible ways forward for that is, of course, to try to create some degree of protection for the customers within those dynamic tariffs. And I'll mention that in a moment a bit more. Then the other thing is, of course, that these consumers have been doing the same thing for many years. In many markets, they've only ever had flat tariffs, fixed tariffs. And so, of course, for them, better the devil you know, it's hard to move forwards. And so in that respect, it's quite important, we feel, to help that customer on a journey, baby steps in a way, to move forward one step at a time. But it's not only the consumers, of course, that are moving forwards from a sort of relaxed position, it's also suppliers. In many cases, their business models are based on those older tariffs, and they see dynamic tariffs as low margin very often. In order to replace that attitude, I guess, in a way, and position, you need to have some degree of new services on the horizon for those companies. You need to unlock those additional services. And in addition to that, one of the challenges, of course, with getting value from dynamic tariffs is naturally to have the ability to respond to those prices. And that may mean you need all kinds of investment, whether that's an EV or whether that's a battery or whether that's any other kind of flexible asset, unless you're going to just respond as a pure behavioral response. And in order to achieve that, we need some degree of stacking of revenue. And how do we achieve that? How do we actually pay for all that stuff? So some of the challenges now, two ways forward for all of this in a way is, first of all, is to have what we'd call hybrid tariffs. And I'll just mention what those are. Another way forward is to have multi-stakeholder services in order to get the stacking and the combined value. Thinking just very briefly about the hybrid tariffs, what we mean by that is tariffs which integrate a dynamic element with some other element as well, to a greater or lesser extent. And these are just a very small selection of those, because I only have a couple of minutes, but basically to say it can be fixed and variable, or more variable and fixed, or it can be fixed and variable and some other element as well. It can be many that are stacked together. We also see tariffs which, for example, are more, for example, EV tariffs that are then added on to some other tariffs, which might not be dynamic. We see scheduling in some markets where you get a benefit in a sense by scheduling your demand. It's not really dynamic tariff, but it links to that. You'll see tariffs, for example, which are dynamic and related to certain assets like heat pumps and not others, or EVs, as we said. Some tariffs which will also include the various other elements that we mentioned, plus, for example, some flexible element which might just occur very occasionally. And then you might get the other extreme, which is, for example, modules related to smart tariffs that give you the option and a variable degree of control over that dynamic tariff. And then also, for example, energy as a service, which will include a dynamic behavior, but you won't actually be thinking about that all the time. And just to say that what these tariffs ultimately do is they provide a customer with a variable degree of risk, a variable degree of exposure to those tariffs, variable degree of action that they need to apply themselves directly. And it also helps them go on a journey from maybe the where they start off to the full extreme at the other end, and they can go at whatever pace they want. So just to say, these are just a few examples, but it helps us move in that direction that we want to move. And we're seeing that all around the world, but of course, it's still a relatively small number of markets. And as we heard, in many markets, you can't even offer dynamic tariffs, or they're just not being offered. And then the other solution is, or other way forward, is a multi-stakeholder service approach, which this is just one example. So we're involved at the moment with a non-profit organization started in the UK, but has many members already, and it's focusing on local energy markets, but it's also gradually moving into a European context now. And just to say that the idea is to decarbonize flexible homes, create homes, build them or renovate them ultimately, which are decarbonized, so no gas heating, they're flexible and developed at scale and in a commercial way. And and those homes would include an integration of stakeholders facilitating local energy systems to garner that what would say the dynamic load averaging, to flatten the load across those homes in order to provide flexibility. And in that way, you're able to provide flexibility for the benefit of the network companies and the suppliers, and therefore you're enabling those homes to go on the grid, but you're providing a service and a flexibility for the DNOs and the DSOs, but you're also providing value stacked on top of that, for example, for suppliers and so on. So essentially what you're doing by integrating a whole range of different stakeholders that I show there, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to say you can then stack revenue as well. And that includes avoided network costs, quicker new build, energy savings, demand side flexibility, home value increase, and also mortgage reductions, just to name some of those. But the main message there is that in order to pay for a lot of this flexibility and in order to make use of those dynamic tariffs, we ideally want to have cooperation between all the different stakeholders, many different models that can be applied to that. But that, I think, is very critical to unlock that potential value with the best outcome for consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Indeed, quite a lot of food for thought in terms of integrated management and optimization of our systems going forward in an increasingly renewable, low voltage consumer profile. So I think this is certainly something that is being considered by many markets, and certainly regulators are preparing the way for this kind of interactive and integrated management of local energy network systems with multiple stakeholders, actors constantly interacting with each other. So very, very interesting as well, also to see different types of models that allow to manage exposure and provide a bit of confidence, security, adaptable to different consumer preferences, needs, and priorities. So I think that's something we'll come back to later in the discussions. But I hand over now to Jacobo Fernandez. He is an expert on retail markets at the Spanish National Regulatory Authority. And they, for a few years now, have had a different type of standard price, the default price, which isn't your traditional regulated fixed tariff, but rather one that's already variable and takes into account the spot price. So you'll tell us a bit more about how that works and some of the lessons maybe they learned from the crisis in 2022, when consumers who were on these tariffs were also confronted with exposure to that volatile market, if you will. So I'll hand over to Jacobo. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. to present our case study where we did an exercise to estimate the potential benefits of modifying the consumption pattern in households under a dynamic price to adapt to the cheaper hours. So the potential benefits are increasing demand in central hours with growing PV energy penetration, savings in consumer bill, and reduction of CO2 emissions. And as Natalie said, as a sample of a dynamic price, we use the VPC, voluntary price for small consumers, which is the most common dynamic price contract in Spain because households with less than 10 kilowatts of contracted power are eligible for this regulated product since 2014. Additionally, in Spain, we have time of use network tariffs since 2021 for all household consumers with different hourly periods. So we consider those peak and off-peak periods too. Therefore, what was our approach? First, we used the data of the year 2023. We use the average consumption profile for households, and according to the consumption data on household electrical equipment and services, we elaborated two scenarios. One for a typical equipped household, excluding those electricity services that are not present in more than 25% of households, mainly space heating. Another one for a totally equipped household. I want to point out that we are not including EVs here because we don't have enough data yet. So we have these two scenarios, as you can see in the top right corner profiles, and then we try to shift some loads to most affordable hours, considering PV production hours and network of peak hours, that is early mornings, weekends, and national holidays, as you can see in the figure below. Then we selected some loads to be shifted, washing machine, dryer to weekends and holidays, dishwasher to central hours every day, and water heating and space heating, assuming that we can accumulate the heat to early mornings and afternoons. And finally, we assessed the impact on CO2 emissions by comparing emissions before and after the shifting of the loads, considering the hourly generation by technology and CO2 emissions factors applied by system operator. So, what were the results? First, a total saving between 8% and 11% on their annual bills, depending on whether they have a typically or fully equipped household. In addition, CO2 emissions will be reduced by 3% for a typical equipped household and by 6% for a fully equipped household, since we reduce demand in peak hours. And finally, if we look to the new consumption patterns on the right dotted lines, we see a potential alignment of increased consumption during central hours with the rise in solar energy generation. Therefore, as conclusion, we confirm meaningful savings in the consumer's bill, the support of renewable energy penetration, and the contribution to decarbonization. So the benefits are there. However, we still have room for improvement in the consumer awareness about all these benefits. So as per our experience, even if around 30% of households are under this dynamic product, most of them still are not totally aware of the potential that they have changing their consumption behavior. Therefore, we continue working to communicate and to inform the consumers. It's true that there were improvements during the energy crisis because people are more aware of this because of the increase on the prices. They search for other possibilities, new offers, but still we have to work. We are trying to improve our comparison tool to incorporate more products, the QR code that we are including in the bill to help the consumer to understand the different concepts of it. We are also publishing a color code as a traffic light to help the consumer to identify the cheaper hours of the PVPC every day, and so on. So that's all for my side. Thank you, and I'll back to Natalie.
Thank you very much, Kako. This is very much in line with what we hope to hear as well now from our behavioral scientist. Piet Lan is from the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, and this is exactly the area that they work on, trying to understand how people behave and how they make the choices they make and why, and what's the best way on that basis of communicating with consumers and trying to explain benefits, risks, and results and impact of their own participation. And this very much goes to, well, the topic of our panel. How can we communicate effectively with consumers so they can understand their potential role and contribution to an energy transition, also what it could mean for them, for the environment, and in terms of their decision-making processes and the elements that they take into account when making choices. So this is something that, Pete, you've looked into actually quite recently. Saw a study that you did for the Irish regulator exactly on this question. Maybe could you tell us a bit more from your experience? What do you think that consumers need in terms of the information that they can make use of in making their own decisions about their energy choices?
Yep, thanks very much. Good afternoon. So yes, we've a paper. It's an open access paper. If anyone wants to read it, it's published in Utilities Policy. It's simply open access and you can take a look at it there. But as a behavioral economist, my honest answer to your question about what consumers need is I don't know. And what a behavioral economist like me and my team would do here is you've got to test it. You've got to actually get stuck in and try to experiment with consumers. And that's exactly what we did in the paper. And we were surprised by the results. So when I say test it, I can give you an idea of what we did. We exposed different consumers to primers, one-page primers, trying to explain to them. These were templates that the energy regulator wanted companies to use to try to explain the way smart meters and time of use tariffs worked and how they could put themselves on a flexible time of use tariff and what that would mean. And as well as exposing them to that and randomizing different people to see different presentations of the information to see which worked best, we tested using multiple choice questions and using tasks where the consumers had to match a simple usage profile to an appropriate tariff. They had to say, look, if a usage profile looks like this, what would be the better tariff to use? So we could objectively see how different presentations of information affected consumers' performance in those tasks and how good consumers really are. So just a few brief lessons from that. The first thing that we found, certainly in Ireland, is actually in terms of attitude, consumers are broadly positive to smart meters. They understand that there are potential cost and environmental benefits, but they find it really, really hard to use them and to actually choose an appropriate tariff. So what we found, and I should say these tasks that we gave people were incentivized. They were rewarded for getting the answers right in the study. And they really struggled. They struggled with the multiple choice questions to understand exactly how smart meters and time of use tariffs work. And they struggled to match simple usage patterns onto the most appropriate tariff, even though we'd given them a full page primer and we'd incentivized them to do this so they could win rewards for getting the right answers. And I think what we get from this is that, in all honesty, information and incentives is simply not enough. In behavioral science, we call this the curse of knowledge, the problem that when we understand and know something, we find it really hard to put ourselves in the shoes of people who don't. And what our studies show actually is that a representative sample of consumers really struggles with time of use tariffs. And there were some surprises in there as well. We thought that by using color-coded clocks, as has become quite standard in industry where these tariffs are being deployed, that would help people to understand. We actually got a backfire effect, particularly among young people. And we realize, of course, that young people these days almost never actually engage with spatial clocks. They're not brought up with them, they don't use them. And actually, they're much more likely to use digital information. So we actually found that presenting young people with the tariff timings and prices in a simple table was much more effective than using a fancy color-coded clock that the marketing people liked. And we also found that describing electricity usage in terms of appliances instead of just simple amounts, that also didn't work for us. And we thought it really might if we sort of gave people intuitive examples to do with appliances. So where do we end up with all of this following a study like this? The problem is harder to solve than we think. It takes more than information and incentives, and you've got to test. You've got to try different ways to communicate the information and test them to see which works. Because even if you have degrees in behavioral science, your hypotheses are often wrong, and you discover when you test them that the world is more complex than that. So I think we've got to find newer, better ways to nudge people to use these tariffs better. We've got to accept that it's a harder problem to solve than information and incentives will allow us to solve. And I think what that requires is, in different countries, it requires more effort, it requires more proper testing that's done scientifically, not through things like focus groups and simple kind of marketing brainstorms. You've actually got to get in there and test it properly and really see what people understand.
Yeah, absolutely. As we regulators often find ourselves saying, the answer to most questions are, it depends. And I think when you're talking about people and behavior and choices, it always depends on the person, on their circumstances, on the way things are phrased, the way they're presented. There are a lot of depends involved in any single decision that we have to make as humans, but certainly as consumers. And as we know, markets will become more and more complex with more offers and more different scenarios, different types of services available, as we also just saw from Philip. So that makes it all the more difficult to really provide a black and white, this is what people react to, and this is how we can do it. And it can very much be sociocultural, it can be demographic, it can be generational, all these different issues that you were just mentioning. They really have a role to play. And we have quite a few questions, really great questions have been coming in on the Slido. And one of them has reminded me of another aspect of this challenge. And that is the difference between types of consumers, in particular vulnerable consumers or at-risk consumers. So those who have a medical dependency or employment situation that means they don't have as much flexibility, so on and so forth. So this is something that while we of course have to promote more efficiency and some flexibility, we have to keep in mind that there are lots of different types of situations, and what can we do for the more vulnerable, and how to ensure that they don't not lose out. I don't mean just even money, but that they're not put at risk in any way for these different systems, trying to manage and shift consumption different times a day. So I think that's also a question maybe for all of our panelists to keep in the back of our minds as we go forward with our debate this morning. We have about 15 minutes, I would say, that we can dive into some of these questions. So if you agree, I'll just pick up one of the ones I see here. And maybe, Seamus, you can tell us a bit more coming from the report itself. We see that there is a low uptake of flexible contracts at the moment across many countries, not all. Why would this be? How can we promote change on this issue? Is it just a lack of information, understanding, communication, as we were just hearing from Pete? Do people just not want them? Do suppliers just not offer them? Or what have you seen so far when canvassing the European experience?
Building it up at a basic level, when you go back to the smart meters, in general, if the smart meter is offered, it enables it. The dynamic price contracts, if you're a large supplier with over 200,000 consumers, you should be offering it to your consumer, a dynamic price contract. You should now, because of the EMD, be offering fixed price contracts as well. That is coming. So it's neither either or. You should be offering both. We do see that, okay, in markets where you have a large rollout of smart meters, these contracts are not been offered yet. Previously they were. In response to the crisis, some of them fell away. More in the Nordic markets, we do see them being offered. But then there's probably an incentive there ingrained because there's a higher electricity consumption rates. So the product is slightly different. If you're in Norway, you're consuming 16,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per annum, whereas in Italy, it's 2,000 kilowatt hours per annum. It depends on, there's other things to consider as well. So do you have heat pumps? Do you have EVs? If you have an EV, A lot of people are quite interested in automatically getting it because they're not interested in charging they don't really care when their car is charged. They just care that it is charged at certain times. And these then open it up for automation. So in general, the smart meters are the foundation stone. We need them. We need them to be utilized. We do see that some suppliers are not offering the product. And on the promotion, I think Jacobo was probably best to jump in there, or maybe Philip will have some insights as well. But in Spanish case, it's a good one.
Yeah, exactly. Jacobo, you were saying is 30% of consumers in Spain are on time of use and on the PVCP. How has that happened? How did we convince people, or was it by default?
In fact, it was by default because in 2014 we introduced this regulated price that is a dynamic price. In fact, so. More of the people, when they started the liberalization of the market, they were continuing with this tariff, and this was reduced with the time, though, so the people go into the free market. But in fact, this is a really dynamic price that is accomplishing with all the requirements of the directive. The problem here is, as I said before, that the people is not totally aware of the possibilities that they have to change the behavior and to be this will be beneficial for their bill and for the system. But additionally, I would like to say it about that we in Spain, we have also time of use network tariffs. So sometimes the congestion of the networks is the opposite to the cheaper prices of with the solar energy. For instance, we have cheaper prices with the energy, but a high demand in those hours. So because of that, we consider in different periods for the networks. So depending when you are consuming, you are paying more tariff to the network than in other periods. And this is thanks also to the smart meters, because also we have a very high deployment of these smart meters.
Thank you, Jacobo. And I think this leads to another question we have here now. Maybe I'll pass this one to Philip, because I think everything is connected. As we know, all these aspects are connected. But this complexity of the mixed signals between good sun hours and good grid hours, and they're not necessarily the same. And how, as the average mortal, can I be tracking energy prices and grid prices and know when I can turn on my machines or not? And that speaks to this issue of automation and management services and something behind the scenes worrying for you, so you don't have to try to keep track and understand all the numbers and the math and decide that it's at 7:15 that you can turn it on, but please stop by 7:27. So these are the kinds of issues that we will face going forward. More flexibility means keeping track of more components. And as a consumer dealing with so many different issues in your daily life, there's no time to be actively managing energy consumption to that degree. So we had some questions here about, what is the role of the utility in promoting some more flexibility and consumer interest and flexible contracts? What is the role of automation in helping with all of this? And where do we see, if you will, where's the drive? Where's it coming from, and how will it get to us at the end to be more mainstream, ultimately, in the way that we all consume and interact with energy? That's a big question. I'm sorry.
I can have a go. I mean, it is totally integrated, and exactly as you said, Natalie. A couple of things to point out. One is that, first of all, you have to have, ideally, you benefit a lot more when you have the assets, which enable you to benefit from dynamic tariffs. So, for example, if you look just at the Nordics, if you have a dynamic tariff and you have an EV, the price you pay for the EV electricity will probably be about half to 1/3 of what it would be if you don't have any real shiftable assets in the home to do that. It's probably a quarter of what you pay with a standard tariff that's not dynamic, mind you, but it's massively less if you have an EV. It's also massively less if you have electric heating. If you have a home where you don't have a lot of shiftable load, then you're benefiting still, but not anywhere near as much. The other thing is the complexity, because very often, I mean, we collect tariffs from all around Europe all the time, right? And the reality is that some of those tariffs are insanely complicated for anyone to understand, even a specialist, let alone a consumer. And this is doubly difficult if you have network and sort of supply tariffs included in that. So the complexity can be so high that no normal consumer could realistically understand that. So then as you said, you're limited to automation and something that will automatically do that. But of course, the downside sometimes with automation, if it's automated without the customer understanding, they don't quite know what's going on. It's almost, you need some degree of understanding so they know what the automation is, the benefit they bring them. Just to say one point that on this, when I mentioned the Local Energy Markets Alliance, one thing that we've been talking very extensively to network companies. It's actually network companies more than suppliers, because the network companies have massive requirements to reduce congestion on the grid. And talk about locational, it's not everywhere, right? In some countries like the Netherlands, it's almost everywhere. In places like Britain, it's most places now where there's a lot of congestion for connections and so on. And so therefore, if you want to develop in an area, if you want to build out, you want to have more assets on the grid as a household, then you end up having problems. And therefore, the network companies are very keen to collaborate to provide funding to avoid investment in the grid, because that investment will take too long. You can use that as a cornerstone client, right? You can use that as a base payment, and then what's left after you fulfill that need for the network, you can then, for example, use that additional flexibility into ancillary markets, wholesale markets, and so on. So you can stack that together. Just to say that I think not to forget that there are ways to do it, but it just needs to be done very simply and understandably. And that's where I think the communication, and last point on that, about smart meters. If you look at the Nordics, where a huge proportion of people have dynamic tariffs, they don't look at their hourly consumption all the time. What they're looking at all the time is the price. What you do with your consumption is you adjust it according to the price. If it's cheap, you charge. If it's not, you don't. And if it's super expensive, you don't do the cooking, whatever. But the reality is you don't need the real-time consumption data all the time in front of you. You need it for reconciliation. And all you need is a price. If you think about simple communication, it can be as simple as that. High price, don't use. Low price, use. It's not so complicated.
Thanks very much, Phil. I think that's a perfect segue to asking Pete a bit more how he thinks consumers can respond in this environment. Keep it simple. Don't complicate things, even if the back office is complicated. Do you think people are able, willing, that this world that we're talking about can be made simpler in terms of consumer responsiveness?
Certainly making it simpler would help, because it doesn't take much complexity for consumers to start to make mistakes, and we can measure that, and we have measured that, and we see that. That's an important issue, actually, and relates to a question you asked previously, was on the slider, that I think is worth saying. I mean, consumers often have very positive attitudes towards time of use tariffs, towards dynamic pricing in principle. And you then say, well, look, if they've got these attitudes, why aren't they switching to them? Why aren't they using them? And we often say, oh, well, it's transferring risk. But the much more important thing is that it's transferring uncertainty. And part of that uncertainty is the consumer themselves not knowing whether they do genuinely understand, as Philip's just mentioned, what they're getting themselves into. They're actually scared of making a mistake. They're scared of appearing foolish. They're scared of being an early adopter who then gets burned. And all of those are uncertainties, not about, how big is my bill going to be according to the dynamic pricing. They're uncertainties about my own capability to understand the system that I'm engaging with and to use it without getting burned. So I think, yes, simplicity is hugely important, and it may be an issue of kind of baby steps, that actually we want to move consumers slowly onto gradually slightly more complicated tariffs and not try to push them too quickly. That, I mean, even getting consumers used to a very simple dynamic tariff for a while before moving them onto something that's more optimal for them is probably a smart thing to do, because they at least get a feel for it and get an understanding for it at a more simple level. I have to confess, as a behavioral economist, I'm deeply skeptical about some of this stuff when I see how complex some of the tariffs being offered are, because we know that if you can confuse consumers to that degree, you can end up actually making money out of them and confusing the whole market. And then we don't get the environmental benefit and the consumers don't get the benefit either. So, I mean, if there are plenty of regulators on this call today, I mean, ensuring a degree of simplicity and drawing a line when something is clearly too complicated for consumer use, which can be tested, I think is an important principle.
Yeah, very good. Thanks very much. In fact, in the study that you recently did, you specifically mentioned there's a difference, and I think we would all agree, between communication and comprehension.
Yeah.
So, you know, bombarding people with facts, with information, with websites is not the same thing as helping them understand. And we heard a bit earlier about different tools, you know, whether it's comparison websites or information. All of our regulators, we publish lots of information and try to be very clear in protecting and defending consumer rights. We also, for example, you know, the Spanish regulator has this interesting QR code in the bill, which goes directly to the website so consumers can see their profile and their consumption information. So to help them get to the place without having to know where to find all the data themselves. So what other kind of mechanisms do you think we can use to bridge this difference between the communication and comprehension?
The primary one I'm going to give you, again, I'm afraid to repeat myself, is just testing. I mean, it doesn't matter how good something appears to the engineer or to the economist or to the expert, behavioral expert like me, who's this ought to work. Until you actually experimentally test it, you don't know. And what we find consistently is that when we test things, what works and what doesn't work surprises us. So I would say it again, the crucial thing to do is to devise different forms of communication and test them and see, are we getting an explicit change in people's comprehension and in their confidence to use the system? Because it isn't just that they need to understand, it's that they need to feel like they understand, that they have a degree of capability and competence within the system. So I think the crucial thing to do is to test it properly.
Nothing like trying it on real people and see if they respond. I think your example about the clock was also very interesting. I guess it's a generational thing. Some of us are more comfortable with the old clock, and I recognize that a lot of people still now check their phone to see what time it is rather than to check their wrist. So there's a big difference over time, that maybe those of us further along in the careers aren't so conscious, and it seems logical to us, but as you say, you have to factor in people in the street and real life preferences. So I don't know, we are running short of time. We had a lot more questions, and I think they're very interesting. But I just wonder if we have time. I think I have to hand over to Sheila. Lots of questions also now looking about electric vehicles and whether we should be trying to understand those tariffs and how they're constructed in the different markets as these grow. So countries are starting to have more and more of these different solutions in their system, so their impact becomes more relevant as well. So there's a lot more to cover, and we'll keep working as CEER and ACER, you can be sure of that. And our future editions of the MMR will also evolve, and we'll keep trying to put our finger on the pulse of how markets are evolving and what we see happening. A very big thanks to our three panelists and to their insights on all the different aspects of retail markets and consumer response to the possibilities. And certainly looking forward to continuing discussions. And I think the behavioral one is key to really delivering any of these innovations besides the automation and the technology. So thanks again for your time and for sharing us your experience and answering people's questions. And with that, I'll hand over to Sheila, who'll give us some closing remarks so that we can keep to time in everybody's busy lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon to all of you. So my role as a host is to close this webinar, provide some policy conclusions, and then say goodbye. Concerning the policy recommendations and concluding remarks, we found very interesting today's discussion. And what we saw that there's a real potential to save on consumer bills, to reduce emissions, but we have to also recognize that consumers have to be made aware. Sometimes they are concerned, sometimes they need more education and also simple information to work and then to use these opportunities that we have today. Some of the case studies, in particular the Spanish case study, show that it's possible to navigate better this environment, to increase demand in central hours and to rely more on the renewable supply. But of course, more work is needed. And we have also learned that both fixed and dynamic contracts, if they are made available, then hybrid contracts will appear in the market. And that's also a very useful knowledge. But what was really exciting in the conversations that we had today, that eventually it's very important that we understand consumers and what they understand out of the options that they are faced with the market. And it's also important that we offer consumers to make small steps. And in this context, hybrid contracts could be useful for consumers to a little bit experiment with the dynamic aspect of certain contracting opportunities. This brings me to the second point, which is important, is when it comes to demand side response, which concerns both households and also industrial users. We noticed in our reporting that we have challenges to collect industrial consumer data and to understand and observe what this group of consumers are needing. And so that's an area where we would like to deepen our understanding. Then there is another element where we have seen incompatibility. This comes to the smart meters. There we see that even in countries where you have a rollout, the utilization of these meters are not so successful. And there might be some sort of incompatibility between the smart meters and the availability of flexible tariffs. Then we also have seen that there is some sort of contractual rigidity in the markets, and we would probably need to reflect further on why is that happening, and then how is it possible to release this rigidity of contracting, and also to see, which consumer groups would be interested in what kind of contracts. So more work is needed there. Then at ACER, we are also firmly standing about the efficient use of capacity. We would like to see that there is demand side response and not only merely an efficient capacity built out. So we would like that comes to a balance, and then practically demand side response creates an opportunity to make the transition more affordable, having the users using flexibly demand responding to the supply patterns. We also see that the framework is very complex. In this legal framework, we have governments, regulators, and suppliers working together. And so our fourth point is that the framework has to become comprehensive for consumers. Consumers should be made aware of the benefits and drawbacks of the flexible energy consumption, and they should be appropriately incentivized, educated, guided, and informed about the collective value of flexible consumption. This flexible consumption should be also recognized in the bills that the consumers received. We also believe that the supplier innovation needs to evolve, and over time we believe that this will take place. We believe that smart meters shall serve their purpose, but also we believe that there should be some acceleration when it comes to the entry of aggregators, third parties who can act on behalf of consumers and provide access, and they should be provided access to consumer data in order that they can play their role. Finally, I would like to call your attention that we also published a dashboard, the price dashboard next to the monitoring report, and that is available also on our website. Equally, as Jana mentioned earlier, the slides and the webinar, as well as the presentations of the webinar, will be made available on our website. And then to say a couple of thanks and appreciation for the discussion today. I would like specifically thank you for the panelists, Philip, Pete, and Jacopo, for coming and discussing with us. I would like to thank Jana and Natalie for opening the the webinar and for running the discussion. I would like to thank for Seamus and all the ACER colleagues who were supporting the webinar today. And I would like to thank you for your active participation and would like to say goodbye to you. Thanks a lot and see you at our next webinar.